So we're going to start by building our web server. There's two trains of thought whether we're going to need to join it to the domain or not. But basically it's going to be a Windows Server 22 operating system with IIS Web Server installed, which is just a feature, and we're going to set the IP address as 192.168.10.12. Default gateway DNS as well, so we can add additional sort of entries into DNS, so we can give it a full qualified domain name, and instead of just web server, and then we'll be able to browse to it. We'll also browse to port 80 on it, and hopefully 443 for HTTPS. Depends if we get the certs loaded or not. I've got a template of a CSS web page, which is one of the programming languages, which sits there server side, and then we'll browse to it from our Windows 10 client, which sits up here. Brilliant. So let's start. First of all, I'm going to build my Windows web server. So just starting to build my sort of vanilla web server, or my vanilla server at the minute. I think when I try to join the client to the domain, or the host, eventually I will need to sysprep it. So there's something that I'm going to do now is just run the sysprep on it, just to sort of show you what this is, just as a quick introduction, because we had a sort of view of it last time, and just to show you and compare. So I've currently got my Windows domain controller here, which actually is a clone of the, so the web server is a clone of this in its pre-vanilla state. So I'm just going to get both with the registry open and show you their GUIDs or SIDs. And so I'll pull up on here first. So I go reg edit. So this is the registry editor that we should be loading. And this is almost just working out the sort of pre-issue that we might have. And as I said earlier, this sits quite happily. The GUID sits within local machine, software, Microsoft, cryptography, and then within there we've got this GUID, or the SID, also known. I'm just going to reg edit on this one, and there we go. We've got the same. So this would prevent them. It's another. If we consider sort of, if we go down, we've got domain name, IP address, MAC address working at layer 2, but within the confines of sort of the application and presentation layer of this, to identify the actual host, we've got this GUID, which is quite important for when it's working out its processes, especially when you're talking about server domain processes. So to change this, what I'm going to do is just delete. I can either rename, so I'm just going to rename this as .old, and then give this a reboot, and we're going to come back and just see it have a different GUID. This should prevent us having to sysprep it, and once it's rebooted, I'll show you again, and then once it's different, we'll carry on with the web server build. Cool. So we're now back with our web server. Just logging on. I'm going to quickly check the registry, see if our GUID's been updated. Then I'm going to set the host name, IP address within the range, and then join the client to the domain. Just to prove there is, from the last video, there are two ways of doing sort of sysprepping or getting over this issue of duplicate SSIDs. So I'm going to reg edit first, just to prove it's changed from me changing it. There you go. So there's the new one, and it's different to the old one, which is good. So I can minimize that for now and make this full screen. Good stuff. And let's quickly set the IP address. Ethernet change. And as I keep saying with Windows, we're going to be resetting things a lot. We're going to be rebooting, and it's a little bit more forgiving than Linux, because we can you can find a way of doing it and making it work, because it's got a GUI front end. And just to verify, we had the correct IP address. So it was 10.12 and Class C subnet mask. default gateway 192.168.10.254, and definitely need DNS. You don't need to, so I know we're going to make this quite vital for being a part of the DNS sort of parent relationship with the domain controller, because a web server can also sit within like a DMZ area. I know people touching saying DMZ, but because it can sit within a DMZ, it doesn't need to be a part of a domain. It can be a standalone server and act as purely as a web server, but we're going to bring it into the domain because of to prove this sysprep issue we had in the previous video, just to rectify it and show you different ways, but also to gain some permissions based on this domain controller. So we can say certain groups of people can access the web server and certain groups can't. So we set this as the 68.10.1, so that's our domain controller again. Press OK and OK. That'll be validating in the background. Rename it as web serve. Rename. Good to go. Cool, so that will need a reboot, and once it's rebooted we'll join back when we try and join it to the domain. Cool, so we're now got the IP address set and the host name. Let's just send it a Control-Delete and get in. And get it to join to the domain, and hopefully without the GUID issue. Right click, properties, should know what I'm doing now, third server in. Starting to become a bit of a domain. And we normally can click up there, or it's either down there depending on how big our window is. Change and ccsc.lan. Apart from how to forget how to spell administrator. We've got the same issue. Cool, so we are going to need to sysprep this one, so I'll be back once I'm at the same stage and having sysprepped it properly, because you can tell it's been cloned. Brilliant, see you in a sec. So we're back to where we were before I had to run the sysprep in the background. So we've got the IP address set and the host name. Now I'm just about to press OK to join the ccsc.lan domain. So we'll just prove that we can join the domain after sysprep again, and fingers crossed, something should appear. Maybe in the background, and it's gone in the background, brilliant. So we've joined the LAN and we're going to restart, so I'll restart, and then as soon as I get back to the desktop, we'll rejoin the video and we'll get IIS Web Servers installed via the server manager. See you in a sec. So we're back logged onto our web server now. I'm just going to go install IIS Web Services to make sure I say it correctly. So we go Manager, add roles and features, and we want to install it on our local web server. And if we scroll down, we can see IIS Web Servers. I want to include any additional tools that I need to install. And next, and yes. Normally with some type of web server, I will be installing a backend database, especially if it's contains some heavy content. So I could be installing MySQL, which is sort of like a Microsoft SQL database. There's MariaDB, which is an open source database, which is quite often used for web servers. But actually, but through my choice, I'm doing this as a Windows domain, so Windows IIS Web Server is an option, but also you've got other web options for web databases like Apache, for example, which can be used to host various open source web solutions and sort of data structures, such like WordPress, or even learning management environment like Moodle, for example. Just loads to mention as soon as you start touching on the open source. But for Windows, for now, we're going to sort of move on with this. I'm not going to install SSL either. I'm just going to sort of keep it to its bare essentials really, just to get the web server up and running, and we'll get that IIS installed. While that's running, I'm also going to add in a few extra DNS entries. So I'm going to call it intranet. So instead of going to webserver.ccsc.lan, as we can see here, we can actually browse to intranet.ccsc.lan. So that sort of obfuscates the name of the server. So we can actually just browse straight to the index.html or the real just a home page. So while that's building, I'm just going to jump on our domain controller and put that as full screen. Control delete, add to our DNS. Cool, so close that. That's our registry, that's our user computers, but I'm after DNS, and I'm going to be adding a CNAME entry, which is like an alternative name. So we can see we've got our web server in here, which has got our IP address of .12. So I'm going to add in a CNAME, which is going to be intranet, and it's going to be fully qualified domain name for web server. Cool, so it's just an alternative name, it's an alias really. So there we go. So we've got intranet, which as soon as we look at intranet, it's then going to look for web server, and then it's going to resolve the IP address, effectively resolving the name to the IP address. Cool, so we've added that in. I'm going to ping intranet as well, just to make sure DNS is working on the web server. So if I go back to our web server, we can see it's now successfully installed, and we're sort of keeping momentum going, which is good. And we can see it's popped up here. If I go right click and then IIS Web Server Manager, we've got it here, and simply all it does in the background is from the C drive, we should end up with a impub and www HTTP root. So this is our sort of root folder where our index.html, our starting point, is stored. So if I quickly jump onto our Windows 10 machine, now that we've actually installed IIS Web Server, we've got some type of website already running, which is the IIS one. Okay. So we'll just check that it's actually correctly installed, and jump on jump on Edge, which is the new Internet Explorer and more secure, especially when working within a fully Windows domain. So if I go web srv, oh, 2 secs, while it's just kicking over fuss because it's the first time I've logged onto it. Here we go. HTTP web srv.ccsc.lan. So that's the actual web server. So that's loading up the IIS sort of front end. So if you ever see that, that's a sort of a vector of attack really, or an indicator of compromise, because that's a case of it's the default web page, and we shouldn't really see things like that. We can change this to intranet, because it's the alias is just changing the name for the web server. So I'm going to come back to that and reload it in a minute. I can either reload by hitting enter or Control R, reloads cache, and we're going to see our web server pop in here. So I've already downloaded a free CSS web page. I'm just going to dump into this area here. So 2 secs. I'll show you how to do it properly on the web server. So this is our web server manager, or the web server console here. If I expand this, and I can see the site and default site, and if I go explore, it takes us back to that same area we were just in, and we can dump our HTML file here. So if I go browse directory, and then we can sort of change a few bits here. We can start and stop the services, so I can restart IIS as a whole. We can employ SSL encryption and do a lot more things. So what I'm going to do is basically bring in the CSS website. It's just like a generic template. We can play around with it a little bit if need be and change the title on it, and then we'll get that to load from our client side. Brilliant. I'll just dump in the file right now on the desktop. Cool, so I've got VMware tools installed on this virtual machine. I'm just going to drag and drop from my real host machine the CSS template, and it's got HTML, and I'm going to copy this, and we can see index.html there. I'm just going to copy this into the same folder in which the root is, and so that's going to copy across nicely. I'm logged on as administrator, so I've got rights, whereas normal users wouldn't. I'm just going to move the IIS stuff into a old folder. I'm not going to delete that just yet until my new site's proven. So 2 seconds, I'm just going to move that into old. So we should load up from this index site, and it's going to pull up a lot more. This is just very much a template site. So in the meantime, it's always good to restart the IIS Web Server services. So considering that we just refreshed the site, we've restarted the services just to get rid of any fresh cache. And now if I jump on the client, it should be loading up BBB and just a fresh site. So this is our CSS web page. Cool, so it's just an example of a sort of, this is a healthcare company, but it's just an example of a website. So we've proven DNS, checked all aliases, we've built the IIS Web Server, it's really easy, and we've also located the source file on the separate web server. It's always good to have a separate web server stored other than our core file server or domain controller. Cool, so next up we've got our Exchange server. I'll see you there. Thanks very much for watching.